The first time I really felt my heart sink was when I got the news. There was no big announcement, no dramatic statement. It was only a murmur that shivered through the palace like a frigid wind. King Charles, the man who stuck by Queen Camilla through every storm, every headline, every cruel remark the world could throw at them, had done something nobody expected. He spent decades demonstrating his commitment, surviving scandals that would have destroyed anybody else. He made a choice that changed everything. And the woman who had been his anchor, his partner, his everything, was about to learn that even the strongest love may be tested by the weight of a crown. From the first, the mood in the royal home seemed different. The crew knew it well before it was announced officially. The talks grew briefer. The doors remained closed longer than normal. Quietly, senior aides strolled around the long, majestic corridors, carrying sealed documents and ignoring queries. Something was happening, important, big something. It hung in the air, thick and taut, like the instant before a storm breaks. The meeting was officially presented as a confidential constitutional briefing, a typical discussion regarding future royal duties. But all of the invited guests quickly knew that this was not an ordinary meeting. Prince William showed up early. He walked with his usual confidence, yet his shoulders were stiff. Catherine was with him, her face calm yet serious. She was good at reading rooms, and she could feel the odd tension in the air before she sat down. Next came Princess Anne. Unlike the others, she showed little emotion. Years of service to the crown had trained her to disguise her cares under an appearance of calm, but she was more on alert than she had been. Prince Edward came last, appearing uncertain of what was ahead. The room was strangely silent. Nobody said what they were called for. Nobody asked any questions. They only waited, the silence growing heavier with each second. Then came King Charles. The hush fell immediately, almost uncomfortable. Those there had seen the king give difficult messages before. They had seen him wrestle with moments of national sorrow and personal loss. But something about this event was different. Charles looked tired, not in the physical sense, but mentally, as if he'd been carrying a boulder on his shoulders for weeks. He moved to his seat with a folder that felt heavier than paper should ever feel. For a few long moments there was silence. The king glanced at the paper before him, then he took off his glasses carefully. His hands shook a little, but enough for those closest to him to see. William glanced at Catherine for a moment. Anne went rigid. Edward dropped his eyes. At last the king began to speak. His speech was quiet, measured, cautious, yet under every phrase was a strain that could not be concealed. He said the stability of the monarchy hinged on clarity, discipline, and trust. No one said anything. Nobody moved. Then came the sentence that altered it all. Charles stated there would be major adjustments to Camilla's future public involvement. For a time no one seemed to breathe. The words hung there in the air, inconceivable, impossible. William's gut tightened in a knot. Catherine sat still. Anne's face was under control, but her attention was at once alert. Charles continued, his voice flat yet husky. Ceremonial duties would be split up in the future. Other members of the family would take on a number of official duties. There would be major adjustments to the organization around Camilla's role. The room could hardly take in what it was hearing. This was not a short-term fix. This was no ordinary rearrangement. Something much bigger was going on, something that would echo through the whole institution. Charles stopped. His eyes still riveted on the paper in front of him. The quiet lasted forever. Then he said something more. He said the choice hadn't been taken lightly. It was after great consideration. It came after painful conversations. Most crucially, it happened after experiences that convinced him change could no longer be put off. Those remarks sent a shock of uneasiness rippling through the room. Which events? What had transpired? No one asked. The king did not say anything. Not yet. Instead, he finished the statement and shut the folder silently. The meeting concluded, but in many respects the true crisis was only beginning. Camilla sat in her private quarters, far from the gathering. She knew that there was a meeting going on. She knew Charles had been with his counselors for days, but she did not expect to be the subject of discussion. Finally, an aide appeared with official paperwork. Her look told all before a word was spoken. A chilly, piercing feeling spread through Camilla's chest. The aide stepped forward shyly, almost sheepishly. Then she handed him the paper. Camilla read the first few sentences 1, 2, 3 times. Her eyes couldn't believe what they were seeing. That was impossible. There must be some mistake. Charles would never go in for this sort of thing. Not Charles. Not after all they have been through. She looked up at once. Did he approve of this? The inquiry came off more pointed than intended. The aide hesitated and then nodded. Yes, Your Majesty. The answer was more of a punch than the text. Camilla was silent for a few moments. The room was curiously remote, as if imaginary. She looked out of the window for an explanation that was not there. The monarch had sanctioned each phrase, each sentence, each penalty. A lifetime of loyalty seemed suddenly questionable. The future she had envisioned was now uncertain. Shock came first, then anger, not angry, explosive rage, something colder, more perilous, the sort that grows in calm, the kind that requires answers. Camilla got out of her chair. Did she need help? The aide asked, anxious. She looked away from the inquiry. It was somewhere else already. She knew just the person she wanted to talk to, one person who could explain what had happened. Charles the King. Without another comment, she placed the paper on a table beside her. Then she walked to the door. She stepped out into the corridor and the royal attendants made way for her. The announcement had not yet been released to the public. The world didn't know it, but inside those walls, everyone already felt the earth move beneath their feet. At almost the same instant, William stood by a window gazing out on the palace grounds. He saw the courtyard below change. Then he saw her, Camilla, strolling purposefully, heading straight for the king's private rooms. William knew immediately what was happening. She had heard the announcement, and now the moment that everyone had dreaded had come, which may be the reason why Charles gave the judgment as king. But the woman who came up to him was not come to speak to a king. She was coming to meet her husband. And before the day was over, the future of the royal family may be changed forever. The hall leading to the king's private chambers had never seemed longer. Camilla moved through it without reluctance. She passed, staff members lowered their eyes. Nobody tried to arrest her. No one ventured to. Enough individuals in the palace knew by now that something exceptional had occurred. They didn't know all the details, but one thing they knew for sure. The balance in the royal family had been changed, and no one could guess what would follow. Camilla's steps resonated on the stone floors. On each step there was disbelief, fury, sadness. She'd been criticized by strangers for years. Headlines about her right to be Charles's consort had been her life for years. Those struggles had been terrible, but they had always been easier since she knew Charles stood solidly at her side. But now, for the first time, that was gone. Suddenly, the woman who survived public judgment was facing something even more terrible. Disappointed with myself. She paused before the door of Charles's study. Briefly only, her hand was near the handle. 1,000 memories raced through her head. The years before they got married, the years they waited, the years they fought to be accepted, every sacrifice, every criticism, every time they told each other that one day things would be different. Those memories seemed curiously remote now, as if they belonged to another life. Camilla threw the door open. Inside, Charles was alone. No counselors, no aides, no secretaries, only the monarch himself. Neither talked for some moments. The quiet was more deafening than any debate. Charles was the first to look up. His face immediately turned regretful. No regret seeing her. Regret because he knew this moment could not be averted. Camilla closed the door after her. You nodded your approval. The words fell like a challenge. Charles did not dispute it. Yes, that's it. Nothing else. No softening of the answer. One word. Camilla looked at him. Part of her had wanted him to say it was a misunderstanding. Some part of her wanted to think he didn't know about someone else's deed. That hope was gone in a flash. You signed your own name on each page. Charles nodded his head. I did. The answer was more painful than she thought. Not that she was surprised, but it verified her darkest worry. For the first time, Charles had chosen something else over protecting her. That realization left a hurt that no title or privilege could heal. Camilla came closer. Why? The query was nearly a delicate sound. Charles glanced away for a moment. Clouds floated across a light afternoon sky beyond the window. It was all easier than the hurt in her voice. At last he said, because I thought I had no choice. But the words merely added to the silence. Nothing to be done. That remark echoed in Camilla's head. It sounded like a fantasy. Charles had managed for decades to defend their connection through every potential catastrophe. Now he said this was different. This time he couldn't keep her safe. Camilla folded her arms in a defensive gesture she rarely made in public. What's different? Charles didn't say anything. His hesitancy spoke volumes more than any immediate answer. Something was different, something important, but he wasn't ready to say what it was, not yet. King went to the fireplace. His shoulders seemed heavier than usual, older somehow. The weight of the crown had always been there. Today it looked visible. When I became king, he said slowly, everything was different. Camilla frowned. That is not an answer. Charles shook his head. It's not. There was quiet, long, uncomfortable, risky. The sort of silence that typically precedes harsh truths. Meanwhile, within the palace, William was talking with Catherine somewhere. They could not focus on anything else. The announcement occupied every thought. Neither had anticipated things to go this fast. Catherine looked into her husband's face. You sensed something wasn't right. William sighed. I could sense the strain mounting. Did you realize it would come to this? Nah, it was true, so he answered promptly. Not even William could have foreseen such a spectacular result. The prince knew there were disagreements behind closed doors. All families had them, but this one felt different. This was forever like. Catherine looked towards the palace gardens. So what happens next? William was silent. For the first time in years, the future looked unclear. Not only for Camilla, but for all of us. Because when a change affects someone so close to the king, its repercussions rarely end there. Camilla's patience was beginning to run out inside the study. She wanted explanations, not cryptic references, not delicate royal language, the truth, nothing less. Charles appeared to get it. He walked slowly across the room and pulled out a drawer. He pulled a slim folder from inside. Camilla knew immediately, not that she'd seen what it contained. She'd seen counselors with similar folders all week. Whatever answers there were, they were in. Charles set it down on the desk. He had his hand on the cover. He paused a time before opening it, as though once he did so everything would be irrevocable. At last he glanced into her eyes. What I'm going to show you won't make this any easier. Camilla's expression grew steely. Show me nonetheless. Charles stopped. He pushed open the folder. There were a number of documents within. Report, notes, 3 observations, records. Camilla felt a tightening in her stomach with unease. The king handed her the first page. She read silently, then another, then another. Her face became a little strange. Confusion, astonishment, then annoyance. By the time she reached the last sheet on the desk, she was angry again. That proves Zilt, but Charles was unmoved. That is enough. No, her voice was rising. It validates assumptions. It reveals patterns. It is concerned. This goes to show people have been discussing. And they have. The king's reply came at once. The room flooded with words. Camilla looked at him for the first time. She realized this may be a lot bigger than she thought. It wasn't about a quarrel or an event or a misunderstanding. For months, possibly longer, something had been growing beneath the walls of the palace. The idea made her uncomfortable. Charles closed the folder gently, deliberately, as if it were something fragile. And then he said words that transformed the whole dialogue. This didn't begin with the announce. Camilla did not say anything. It started much before today. The monarch stopped, his gaze fixed on the papers, then back to her. And if we're going to understand how we got here, we need to speak about what went down in Windsor. The room grew quiet, too quiet. They both knew exactly what day he was talking about. And they both knew that once they opened that door, there was no going back. Then Camilla produced something from her handbag. Without a word, she took out a little thing and set it on the desk between them. The moment Charles saw it, his whole face altered. The thing resting between them was more than a piece of jewelry. It represented everything they had built together. And then the discourse was no longer about royal duty. It was about their wedding itself. Charles and Camilla were quiet for a few long seconds. All attention seemed to be drawn to the object on the desk. It was a brooch small enough to slip into the palm of a hand, but weighty with significance. She has worn it at some of the biggest occasions of her royal life over the years. It was more than jewelry now. It was a symbol of loyalty, of being part of something, the journey she and Charles had walked together. It was now between them like evidence in a trial. Camilla clasped her hands. She spoke slowly. If we're going to talk about Windsor, let's talk about everything. Charles nodded. He realized there was no other way out. The conversation had finally come to the topic they had both been avoiding. The start, just months before, Windsor Castle had played host to what appeared to be a fairly standard royal planning meeting. No cameras, no big headlines, no public controversy, at least not on the surface. Just a few top royals and palace staff had been there. The objective appeared straightforward, preparing for future ceremonial appearances. Discussions about future obligations, nothing special, but the tensions had already begun to build under the formal agenda. William and Catherine were taking on more and more important roles. The public's support for the Prince and Princess of Wales continues to increase. More crucially, many palace advisors were starting to look to the future, not the present, in subtle ways. Inheritance was the future. The future was transformation. The future was about getting ready for the day William would finally be king. Nobody said it, but everybody knew it, even Camilla. It was getting harder and harder for her to deny the truth. She had spent years gaining acceptance in the institution, years proving herself in, years combating the public animosity. Now and then she thought the focus was moving away from her to the next generation, to William and Catherine, to a future in which her own part looked diminished. At first the feelings were private, then it was Windsor. The brainstorming session took place in one of the castle's ancient rooms. The staff had prearranged the seating arrangements. Every seat counted, each slot reported status. Every element reflected the hierarchy of royalty. To the outside observer, the arrangement may have looked minor. It was quite important in the royal circle. Charles had already signed off on the final plan. Catherine had been given the primary role, not that she had demanded it, not that anybody had sought to weaken Camilla, but because several advisors felt it represented the way the monarchy was going, a symbolic nod to the future and nothing more. At least that was the plan. When Catherine arrived that morning, she knew at once that something was wrong. The room was already prepared. Most of the people weren't there. Then she saw the layout of the seats. Her designated place was not where it should have been. Someone had shifted it. At first she thought there must be some error. Then she spotted who was sitting on the middle chair. Camilla, the queen consort, sat still, her hands on the arms of the chair. Gathered, certain, purposeful, Catherine stood in the doorway and paused. Neither woman said a word. No need to do that. The message was unmistakable. Several staff members immediately found papers, files, and walls to be of great interest around them. Nothing but the anxiety coming to life before their eyes. One aide sidled up to him warily. He leaned towards Camilla. His voice was no more than a whisper. "Your Majesty, I suspect the seating plan might have been changed." Camilla looked at him, then the chair, then back at him. "I'm comfortable where I am." The aide came to a dead stop. There was nothing else he could say. Not in public, not without making a fuss, so he backed off. The room was still. Catherine might have said anything. She might have just raised it right away. No, but she moved to another chair. The decision shocked everyone, especially those who had expected confrontation. But Catherine knew something vital. There are moments when quiet is more powerful than debate, and sometimes decency wins more than triumph. Later, when William came in, he was impressed at once by the atmosphere. He saw the new setup. He saw Catherine somewhere else. Above all, he spotted the chair in the middle. His jaw hardens. The prince did not say anything. First, no, but many who knew him well saw the warning flags. He was nuts, not due to a chair, not out of protocol, but because he felt someone had deliberately put Catherine in an impossible spot. The meeting went on, but there was a tension in every topic, every statement, every gaze. The problem was not solved before it was over. There had been no incident, officially. Everyone unofficially knew better. Charles heard of the incident later that night. He put it down to a misunderstanding, to a simple mistake. Then Princess Anne asked for a private talk. That request gained his quick attention. The Anne you knew did not overstate, but she didn't pick arguments very often unless she thought they were serious. She brought a file into Charles's office, a thin file, but one that seemed heavier than it should be. She put it on his desk. "I think you should read this." Charles opened it. Inside were staff notes, schedules, internal emails, observations gathered over several weeks. Separately, nothing looked problematic. In some, they told a disturbing story. Instructions were changed, recommendations postponed, ceremonial preparations revised, positions reevaluated. Not out in the open, not spectacularly, but routinely. The pattern pointed to something beyond coincidence. Charles read in silence. As he went on, he felt more and more uncomfortable. Finally, he looked up. "What is this I hear?" Anne's answer was simple. "I'm telling you, Windsor didn't mean to happen." The room was silent. Charles examined the papers. Some part of him wanted to deny the conclusion. A part of him wanted to find other explanations. But the facts posed uncomfortable questions, questions he could no longer ignore. Were personal matters starting to affect official decisions? Are private insecurities public actions? Were lines crossed that should never have been crossed? The king spent hours going through the stuff, then days, then more days. Each answer seemed to breed new questions. Camilla, meantime, knew little of how seriously the problem was being taken. She knew there had been friction. She was aware that some individuals didn't approve. What she didn't realize was how widespread the fear had become among senior individuals in the palace. Things had passed beyond her control by the time she realized. Back in the present, in the king's study, Charles snapped the folder shut. Windsor was still weighing heavily on his mind. Camilla stayed sitting opposite him. Her look had softened a little, not because she agreed, but because she finally comprehended the size of the problem. It had turned into a symbol of broader worries, larger disputes, larger questions about the future. But neither was willing to give in. Still not. Camilla stepped forward. "You believe this was a matter of power?" Charles gazed intently at her. "Nope, so what was it about?" The king drew a big breath. His answer was calm. It was to do with the future. She glanced away, for she knew in the depths of her heart that the future had become the center of everything. The future of the crown, the future of William and Catherine, the future of her seat next to Charles. And now that future was making decisions no one wanted to make. Charles got up slowly from his chair and went to the window. The gardens outside were still tranquil and beautiful, untouched, a striking contrast to the tempest brewing inside the palace. And finally he spoke again, his voice seeming heavier than before. There was another paper in Anne's file. Camilla turned to face him. The king stood with his back to the window, didn't show it to anybody. Her gut suddenly clenched. "What paper?" Charles stopped. For the first time that evening, he looked genuinely regretful. Then he said, "The one that made me realize I couldn't put off a decision any longer." In that instant, Camilla realized there was something she hadn't seen. Something secret, something powerful enough to change everything, something that eventually prompted Charles to make the decision she dreaded most. Those remarks made the room seem smaller. Camilla sat still, watching Charles as he stood at the window. For the first time since the study had begun, rage gave way to doubt. There was one more paper, another piece of the narrative, another rationale for the decision that had shattered her world, and whatever it said must have been vital enough to convince Charles that there must be no more delay. Slowly, the king turned toward her. His eyes had no triumph, no happiness, simply fatigue, the type that comes from bearing a burden too long. Camilla was the first to speak. "What was it?" Charles came back to the desk. For a few moments he just stared at the folder, then he opened it cautiously, almost unwillingly. Inside there was one document, but this one was different. There were no staff observations, no schedule records, no internal reports. It was something far more disturbing. A summary prepared by senior advisors, a synopsis of how ongoing difficulties inside the royal household could ultimately threaten the stability of the monarchy itself. Charles pushed it across the desk. Camilla read to herself. The more she went, the tighter her hold. A few paragraphs set forth the rising anxiety among the officers of the palace. Others concentrated on public opinion. Some focused on the more and more delicate handoff to the next generation of royal authority. One statement seemed to differ from all the rest. It pointed to unresolved antagonism between royal households that could eventually wear down public faith in the system. Camilla put the paper down. Her face was all disbelief. "You think that?" Charles replied at once. "I had to watch it. It's just guesswork. It's worry. It is fear. That is counsel." Camilla put the document on the desk. "And now counsel is more essential than your woman." The question was like a knife. Charles shut his eyes for a second. That of all the charges he had expected was the one he feared the most, for there was no answer to alleviate the sorrow underlying it. Slowly the king sank into a chair opposite him. Camilla stood there, not for excuses, for truth. At last Charles spoke. "It has always been about picking advisors above you, so what is it about that?" He looked at her. "It was the first time in my life I had to choose between safeguarding a loved one and protecting the institution I served." The room went quiet. Camilla glanced aside. Deep inside she knew precisely what he meant. The crown came at a price, that was common knowledge, but understanding a thing and living it were two different things. For decades, Charles had been able to balance the two worlds, love and duty, personal loyalty and national responsibility. And now those worlds were converging and something had to give. The realization stung more than either of them cared to admit. Shadows of evening extended along the corridors of the palace beyond the study. Most of the personnel had gone home, the other whispered. There were already rumors going around. No official comment had been made, but the strain was there in the air, inside secret offices, inside security rooms, inside every conversation behind closed doors. People felt they were in the middle of history, but they didn't know its full contours yet.